is only 28% of how long Disney's been a company, and the math was easy on that one. Disney, we are celebrating Disney's 100th anniversary this year. And here at the film festival, we are looking specifically and celebrating women's contribution to animation in those 100 years. Women that were there on day one with the company, and the thousands of women who followed have made significant contributions to Disney animation and the success of the company. And you're in for a treat, because we literally have the woman who wrote the book on the subject of women in Disney animation. And she's going to speak for a little bit on the history and the contribution that women have made. And then you're going to see an all-new, fully restored version of Cinderella. This has never been seen before. You will never see this version in a theater, and it has been meticulously restored frame by frame. And it's a version that how Walt initially envisioned it. So you're really in for something special there. After the screening, if we have time, there'll be an opportunity to talk to Mindy and ask some questions. But then we have some complimentary copies of her book available, which she's willing to sign outside near the information desk there. So without any more talking from me, we'll turn it over to the expert, Mindy Johnson.
Thank you. Thank you, Stuart. Well, it's great to be here, and thanks so much for coming out on a warm Saturday morning for some great animation. Let's jump in. We've got a lot to cover and explore here. As Stuart mentioned, we are celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Walt Disney Company. And yes, from the very beginning, women have always been there. We focus on the wonderful talent of the 9 old men and many others, but let's talk a little bit about, many of you I'm sure are familiar with this gentleman, the great Walt Disney. And he's one of our treasures, one of our great storytellers. And in the grand tradition of storytelling, it really comes down to the individual vision, the person telling the story, just as good filmmakers do, to give it their view, their take, their vision. Walt Disney cultivated a lot of terrific talent, and we know the legendary 9 old men of animation. Many people thought that Walt did all the work himself. He didn't. But he had wonderful, talented artists, animators, men working with pencils that had erasers so they could fix whatever they needed to correct. But these gentlemen, of course, were masters. But right alongside them, there was a rich, diverse collective of artists at the Disney Studios. In the 1930s, as World War II was raging, just getting underway in Europe, there was a tremendous influx of immigrants. And many of these brilliant artists came to work at Disney Studios. So we have a rich history of immigrants at Disney within its 100 years. We have a wonderful realm of artists coming from Latin America as well historically. There is a rich history of Asian Pacific artists working at the studio all throughout the 100 years, as well as, yes, African American artists from fairly early on. It wasn't always an art form that people were aware they could participate in, but at Disney, it didn't matter what your hair color or shoe size were. It was about your ability to create. And yes, even LGBTQ artists, more so very open about their preferences and orientations as we move into the 1980s and 90s. But we do find historically there were artists who then later came out. And a wonderful part of the story at Disney Artistry is, yes, it's quite a bit of longevity in animation. We have many artists who've lived in their 80s, 90s, and even into the 100s. And so some terrific examples of artists who still would come in and mentor the artists in their 80s and 90s. Sadly, the woman down in the lower corner, Ruthie Thompson, she lived to be 111 years young. We lost her just a year ago. She lived through the first pandemic, the 1918 pandemic, and here it was this one that sadly got her. But she was incredible. She was also one of the first women in the camera union. Walt ensured that her work and the work of others. We also have artists who are other-abled. Wang Ming-Cheng on the left is a brilliant Chinese from China, came to the United States and worked at Disney creating sculptures for Bambi and creating three-dimensional characters for the artist to work from. He suffered from polio terribly, which caused some major impairments for him. But he went on to continue to become one of the great visual effects artists in Hollywood. If you're a Star Trek fan, he's the guy who developed the tricorder and the communicator, which are like flip phones. So every time I see someone with a flip phone, I think of Wang Ming-Cheng. The gentleman in the middle, Lloyd Turner, you'll see at the bottom here, there's a lovely, handsome photo of him. In his paperwork, his left arm had been amputated. We don't know how or what the purpose or reason was, if it was an injury or disease or something, but a very talented animator working in the industry. And on the right, in her day, in the 1940s, she was a Rosie the Riveter with a pencil. The great Enid Denbo Wizig, she worked in ink and paint and then moved into animation. She worked very closely and was trained by Art Babbitt and Bill Melendez, other great artists in animation. Enid is deaf, and she learned to speak with reading lips. Her mother did not want her institutionalized in the 30s and 40s as a young girl. During the war, she came to work in animation, and she worked on a lot of training films. And there she is today. She just turned 100. Yeah, so a lot of tremendous powerhouse people of diverse orientations and backgrounds coming to work at the Walt Disney Studios collectively over this 100 years. So we're going to go back. Let's go back in time, and we can even drop the lights here so that we get really into our time machine. 1923, a very young Walt Disney makes his way to Hollywood. He'd had a little bit of business trouble in Kansas City. It didn't go quite well, so he needed a fresh start. Makes his way to Hollywood, and before he leaves, he sends a film that he had created in Kansas City to M.J. Winkler, the leading distributor of novelties at that time. Now, M.J. Winkler is the woman to the right, Margaret Winkler. She added a fictitious J to her name and operated in a gender-neutral fashion. And people thought she would correspond with theaters all over the country, all over the world, indeed. And they thought, well, I've been corresponding with a man. Nope, that's her. And she was responsible for making Felix the Cat, Coco the Clown, and other novelties as a standard part of the movie-going experience. So whenever you're watching animation today, even Disney animation, we owe that to Margaret M.J. Winkler. Now, it's Margaret who gave these two young gentlemen their start, Walt and Roy Disney. She said, I think we can do business after seeing Walt's first short film. And their first order of business was to hire their first employee. Her name was Kathleen Dollard, and there she is. She had a fun twinkle in her eye and a great sense of humor, and she was doing a little bit of everything, primarily what was called blackening in of the cells. And from her family, I have it on good authority, she had been, Walt Disney, a young Walt Disney, proposed to her. And she turned him down because she didn't think he'd amount to anything. So you can see how the little storefront, very tiny little studio, there are no known photographs. Ruthie Thompson, the woman I pointed out, was a little 10-year-old girl who would walk past the storefront on her way to school. And, well, what are you doing? We're making cartoons. Go on inside. So she was kind of the little mascot, and she was my eyes and ears into this place. And you can see by the posters, they would use basic ink from the local hardware store to fill in, blacken in, because the film stocks couldn't read the imagery if it was just in pencil. And the blackeners would sit towards the front area in the pink, and it was men and women doing this. And at times you'd have to do about 10,000 cells to get them to read for an entire film. Now the next example, we move a little forward in history, and Lillian and Edna, the Mrs. Disneys, Walt and Roy's wives, Lillian had worked at the studio, but every time there was a film that needed to get out, they would help with blackening in the cells. Now, these are the earliest known drawings of a couple of characters. Maybe you're familiar with them. Any guesses? Mickey and Minnie, yeah. We forget that when Mickey was born, so too was Minnie. So working in the garage and at their kitchen tables, they had to complete over 10,000 cells. So Lillian and Edna, and that's Kathleen Dollard, she came back and helped out her friends to complete the first Mickey and Minnie cartoon. Now, we think that that was Steamboat Willie, but actually it was a little film called Plain Crazy. Charles Lindbergh had just crossed the ocean, and it was a huge phenomenon. So Walt thought, well, with my new characters here, I'm going to spoof the events of the day. So we take off, we do a little takeoff here, but Mickey and Minnie appeared in that first cartoon. He's a bit of a daredevil there. But the voice of Minnie Mouse, that was actually Walt Disney. Who, me? That was Walt Disney. He provided the first voice for Minnie Mouse. Now, you're reading that correctly. This is what we always thought women did. They were just pretty girls who traced and colored. It was all color by number. And they pulled anybody off the streets to do it. No, they didn't do anything of importance. Well, fasten your seatbelts. We're about to change what you think you know. Now, welcome to the very first paint lab of the Walt Disney Studios. That's Dot Smith, and she's stepping up. If you remember from the short clip, it was black, white, and 3 or 4 shades of gray paint. Well, Dot is helping herself to the colors, the shades that she needs. That's all the more that film could handle. That was the latitude in the late 1920s. But we can date this picture. If you see on the upper right, Dot's wearing a dress from about the 1930s. The little studio's hero and heroine are very popular, and you can buy fabric to make Mickey and Minnie clothing with. So next time you put on your Mickey Mouse t-shirt, remember Dot Smith and her fabulous dress. So the artists would step up and help themselves to whatever paint they needed. And by the early 1930s, it's a boom town at the little studio, and women are everywhere. Now, here we are in the inking, tracing, and opaquing department at this point is what it's called. And the woman on the right is Hazel Sewell. Hazel ran the department from the late 20s to the advent of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And in her roughly 10 years, she is single-handedly responsible for transforming how we see and experience animation. Let's explore how. Now, in 1932, the Disney Brothers signed a contract to give them a new distributor. And so they needed to keep churning out the cartoons that they had agreed on. Now, this is their latest Silly Symphonies. And we have the Mickey sign, if you recall, the Mickey sign over the studio here. We've got the popular Mickey and Silly Symphony series happening now. So with the Silly Symphonies, Walt saw a demonstration on a new technology called three-strip Technicolor process. Finally, there were other forms of color, but they were kind of inferior. Finally, this was going to work right. We live in a very Technicolor world, and he could recreate what we see on screen. But they had a contract they had to complete. So they reached out to their distributor and said, look, we'll finish this film as we agreed, but give us some extra time and we'll try it in this new Technicolor approach. So the animators did their drawings, but the women had to step in and with black, white, 3 or 4 shades of gray, complete the film where they would ink on the front in black ink and then paint everything on the back with 3 or 4 shades of gray on the back side of the cell. They put it through camera, and then once it was through camera, to meet their contract, they completed it in black, white, 3 or 4 shades of gray. But once it was completed, they carefully took all 10,000 cells, individual pieces of plastic had artistry painted on it, each a little different, and washed off the back side of black, white, and 3 or 4 shades of gray, and added 80 shades of color that they found at the local hardware store, and created the first 3-strip Technicolor animation ever. Now, this is the first animation to receive an Oscar. And these are the women that did it, not the men with pencils, because there's nothing different. Exactly. There's Hazel, and she's wearing her 1932 Olympics blazer, so we can date the photograph. And the ladies are celebrating Mickey and Minnie's 4th birthday. And yes, the studio cats, if you remember the Mickey Mouse sign, it was the Depression, and so people couldn't take care of their pets. So many times they left their cats over the studio walls because they thought, well, with a sign like that, they've got a big rodent problem. So the woman in the back with the black and white and the little bob, her name was Marcelle Gardner. She was a later voice for Minnie Mouse many, many years. And we have many of the other department heads. And here they are celebrating not only the birthday, but their Oscar win. Now, we're going to step inside. We've got 80 shades of color that we found from the local hardware store. And these are paints that you use to paint furniture or a side of a barn. They aren't necessarily meant for painting on nitrate cellulose. So, but we work to try to find the blends and the colors that we want. And they've started training now, and we're in the inking and painting department now. They've elevated their game. And Hazel divides her teams, and she noticed in order to expand the quality of animation, we need to get our caliber up. And she begins to train her artists in almost calligraphic work. Inkers are separated. These are the artists who have a fine line capability. And look how they had to break down the lines for the characters. And you can see, like Minnie's tail, how thick that is. And then it tapers out to a really thin line. Every line you see on the cells are tapered in and tapered out and are a specific width. So, and it cannot break. It has to be a single stroke. With pencils, we can sketch all day and we can erase. But if you're working with ink in an ink pen, a crow quill ink pen, it has to be exact. So the women worked carefully. Now you're looking at the rare side of a cell, the B side, the back side. And you can see they would ink on the front, and then on the back they'd have to create a mirror image of the imagery on the front that the camera sees. So, but it had to be opaque. You had to split those lines so the paint colors would kiss each other, but never slop over. So you had to be really careful about it. And you could choose whatever brush you wanted. One day a woman wore an Angora sweater, and if you've ever worn one, it goes everywhere with fuzz, got all over an entire scene. So they had to redo it all, which was costly and time-consuming. So they started instituting visors because hair could fall and land on the cell and it would look like a giant boulder or lumber on the screen. And they had to wear hairnets and smocks, and on a hot July day with no air conditioning, this is where the men left the department. They couldn't take it. By 1935, Walt built a state-of-the-art facility for the women of inking and painting. And it was the first building on the West Coast to have air conditioning because the paint was subject to the temperature. On a hot, sticky day, it would never dry. On a cold, brittle day, it would dry too quickly or it wouldn't blend properly. So they were always having problems. So we're going to step inside here in the little pink box. And the woman seated at the very front, we're going to meet her here in a second, shortly. But I want to introduce you to a couple of other women, several women who were very instrumental at the studios. The woman up on the upper left is a woman by the name of Bianca Majoli. She was an immigrant from Italy and a brilliant artist, and the first woman in the story department to create visual ideas for how certain stories could be conveyed in animation. Underneath her is the second woman in the story department, Grace Huntington. Grace was a powerhouse. She was a record-breaking pilot. I'll talk about that in a second. Up on the upper right is a woman by the name of Dorothy Ann Blank. She is the first woman, she's one of two women credited on Snow White and Seven Dwarfs for writing. She's the one who wrote the screenplay for Snow White. Walt decided years before that he wanted to bring someone in who could find ideas for telling stories on a larger scale. Every feature film today, not only in the Disney studio, but everywhere, she established the basic tenets for exploring the possibilities and what needed to be in place to tell a great feature-length animated film. So we owe that to Dorothy Ann Blank. And underneath her is Mary Goodrich and Linda Granger. Mary started the story research department. So these ladies were kind of the Google of the 1930s. And they used these really cool things called books. Maybe you've heard of that. And what does a diamond mine look like? And what would a huntsman's jerkin look like? These ladies would go out to find that and provide those resources for the artists. And they also looked for good story ideas. Now, as I mentioned, we had a couple of record-breaking pilots there. There's Grace Huntington. She broke a high-altitude small aircraft record for women in 1940. And sadly, she left the studio to train for this. Sadly, she couldn't get a job in aviation because, she's a woman. So she ended up becoming a flight instructor, and sadly she later wrote that she was training far inferior men to become pilots to get jobs she could not get. Mary Goodrich was the first licensed female pilot in the state of Connecticut, and then also became the first syndicated aviation columnist, one of the earliest in the country. She would fly in to file her reports. Sadly, she was missing her landings. Her eyesight didn't get very good, so she had to hang up her aviation career and traveled across country and started the story research department at Disney Studios. So pretty remarkable ladies behind the scenes. Now we're going to meet the woman I pointed out in the inking and painting rooms. Mary Weiser is her name. She was a brilliant artist, and she kept recognizing the problems that were perpetual with these paints that were designed for other purposes. And it was costly and time-consuming, and she said, you know what, we can do better. So she went out and studied chemistry and got her degree, as one does, right? Okay, I'm going to fix this. So she went and got her degree in chemistry, and with Walt and Roy's blessing and Hazel Sewell's, they said, great, and they established the first and only paint lab in the world creating paints exclusively for cell-based animation. It is not Betty Crocker's kitchen. These ladies were creating, and this was Madame Curie's lab. These women were creating formulas and solutions and dye techniques that revolutionized animation. Now, you remember our 80 Shades of Color. Now, by the time that was in 1932, by 1937 and Mary's advent with the paint lab in 1935, we are now at over 1,500 shades of custom created color. almost Rembrandt-esque quality to the painting. Now, Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston, two of our 9 old men of animation, said, we didn't think we could do a feature-length story until we saw what the women accomplished in color with the Old Mill, one of the Silly Symphonies, which introduces the multiplane camera. Now, Hazel Sewell guided her teams to these advents, which forever transformed animation. In the paint labs, they could also achieve texture with the paints, kind of a luster. So you get this sensation of velvet curtains and satin robes and metallic finishes, all based on the artistry of the women designing the paint. It's paint. But we get that. That's a foreboding window pane that it's gonna lay over the queen as she parts those regal velvet curtains. That's all accomplished with paint. Now, one of the other advents here, oops, we lost my other example. If you look at Cinderella's, or Snow White's cheeks, I'm getting excited for Cinderella already. Snow White's cheeks here, Walt wanted this idea of realism, and earlier versions of cheeks on animated cartoons were little ovals and very cartoony looking, and he knew that would never work. Audiences would never buy that for a feature-length film. Now, there's a charming myth that the ladies used makeup, their own makeup on the cells. Well, it's a myth. I found the actual logs. Mary Weiser and another chemist in her department, Jeanette Toner, were conducting tests, and they had over 300 trials notating every variation, and they finally discovered a combination of pink and orange translucent dye to get the right blend to give a realistic sensation to Snow White's cheeks. The women also, you can see a little bit of a hint of gray on her hair. Those were dry brush techniques, so her hair would have a sculpted dimensional quality. Now, Mary holds a couple of patents for that. It's called the blend technique. And they also used it to get fur on the rabbits and the animals of the forest. And she holds patents for these, which were still used, and they created like an early pastel crayon to do that on the cells. So let's go behind the scenes. That's where that line comes from. That's Mary Weiser. Now that's actually a misnomer. It was more like 350,000 cells painted as individual pieces, and you can see they're not that big, but when we project them on the giant screen, now you see the cell levels here. Now each cell has a color cast, so we have to make the paint adjust for that. So we have Snow White Blue 1, Snow White Blue 2, Snow White Blue 3, Snow White Blue 4. So there's a rubric, there's a dimension of color that we have to stay consistent with as well. Now, these are camera tests, very rare camera tests you guys are getting to see. And you'll notice something a little different here. Snow White's dress is not the right color. This is from August, and the film releases in December, and we're still trying to figure out color qualities. These are camera tests for illumination to see how many frames it's going to take to get the candle to illuminate just where we want it. Again, that's all done with paint and how we time it and how intense it's going to be. So it's very painstaking. Now, you'll see some different forms to Snow White here. She looks very like a little doll almost, and her dress is very different. So the artists are exploring with color to see how much more we can push this, how much more lifelike or sophisticated we can get in the quality of our artistry. They're also testing the lighting. Here, this is backlit, and that green goo that the evil queen is mixing is actually from the bile of an oxen to get that greenish glow. They had to develop all of this in the paint lab because none of it really existed. This is a multi-plane shot, and it's going to run again. Took a couple of weeks to create this, but they had to completely redo it because Snow White's dress is the wrong color that we finally settle on. Now watch the translucent shadows. Those are applied on a different cell level. You could see as she goes by. And watch how you get this sensation of velvets and satins in the queen's gown. Again, that's all done by paint and the women of ink and paint. Now, women were in other departments as well very early on. At the top, we have Shirley Soderstrom. She was sculpting models so that the artist could see the characters in 3 dimensions. Marion Wiley Stewart, the second woman in the red, was the first female background artist at the studio. She was there from Pinocchio through Bambi. She introduced oil paints to give the forest of Bambi a real depth and quality. Louisa Fields, standing there with the musical score, she is the first female music editor in Hollywood. Walt brings her in to work on a film about music, which was Fantasia. Peggy Johnstone started in ink and paint. She was a Chouinard Art Institute grad, and she moved into illustration and conceptual design early on at the studio. The great Gyo Fujikawa is an incredible story. She was a brilliant artist who worked and designed Fantasia. If you've seen the mushroom dance sequence in Fantasia, she wanted to see her story, her people, her image on screen. So she proposed that idea, and that was as a result of Gyo Fujikawa. She also designed many of the early consumer products material and the program for the film. Sadly, during World War II, with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Walt moved her to New York and got her a job working with one of the vendors. Her family was interned in one of the Japanese relocation camps. But Walt kept her in New York free. She could move about, and she was working. He would check in on her. She also broke ground as an illustrator. She's the first illustrator to fight for and get royalties. So if any of you are thinking of illustrating children's books and want to get royalties, you have Gyo Fujikawa to thank for that. The woman next to her in the blue box here is Barbara Worth Baldwin. She ran the airbrush department. She had 20 men and women working under her, doing a lot of visual effects. We're going to see some examples of her work. The 3 women seated in the lower orange box there is Sylvia Holland, Faith Ruckus, and Ethel Kulsar. These women were the secret weapon behind Fantasia. Sylvia Holland designed many of the segments in that film. We're going to see some of their work as well. And on the far right is Viola Anderson and Mildred Rossi. They were the first color animators. Mildred was the first female animator at Disney. We'll talk about their work in a second, but I'll let Walt tell you. By Mary and the women in the paint labs. And you'll see the women artists here working on the final cells.
brush technique was used. In this technique, the brush is wiped almost dry of paint before application, leaving a grainy chalk-like texture on the cellulite. Where soft lights and shadows were called for, airbrush was used on the action cells. And here is our single-frame motion picture film completed. The care that was taken here is typical of the more than 20,000 frames that comprise the Nutcracker suite.
Let me repeat that, 20,000 frames. So you've got to recreate that 20,000 times, each slightly different. Now here's Ethel Kulsar with an original conceptual piece that she's working on there for Fantasia. And let's go in and look at a couple of studies. These were not in the film, these were studies. The women would do these to keep their hands in practice, to get their lines tapered properly, to get the size right, to get everything to move and flow solidly. Now, and I love on the right, you can see just with that dry brush technique how much dimension you get with a single stroke. Now here's a final frame from the film, and take a look. Let's punch in just I don't know if we could go a little closer. We are in the close-up here. You can see there's a little bit of airbrush underneath there, and then every line is tapered in and tapered out. And it has to match a little different, but the same length, the same width as the frames before it and the frames that follow. So let's put it in motion. It's remarkable when you see it in that setting. Now, who doesn't love monsters, right? In Fantasia, we have the evil Chernabog, the creature of darkness. And Walt wants this creature to be defeated by light. So how do we make that happen? Enter Mildred Rossi. Now, Mildred was a brilliant artist. She started in the paint labs and worked in mixing the colors, moved into inking, and then her talent was just so prevalent that she moved into animation. And in Fantasia, there's a lot of what are chalk pastel, sort of suggested images. How many of you have worked with chalk pastels? They go everywhere but where you want them, right? They're a little messy. So Mary Weiser and her teams, we have to somehow get that effect onto nitrate celluloid, those clear cells. Mary and her teams developed a spray adherent. So it was clear, you could spray it onto the cell, and then you could use your chalk pastels and whatever you put on there stayed on there. Then they developed a clear sealant to seal it up so it would be protected as it moved through camera and the whole checking and production process. Now, Mildred, we're about to see a segment of this, of Chernabog, Nothing to Fear, because light comes to save the day. And it's Mildred's artistry that does the trick. So we're going to watch this segment. You're going to see some of these little swirls of smoke and little ghostly creatures they're very safe. They're not going to harm anybody, I promise. I'll protect you. But that's our friend Barbara Worth Baldwin and her airbrush teams. And when the chimes strike and you see the light come to defeat the creature of darkness, that's Mildred Rossi's chalk pastel color animation. Here we go. So here's her work as well. All the airbrush. there. And the work of Mildred Rossi. Mildred went on, and that was her first monster. She went on and designed other monsters at another studio, Universal. She's the designer behind The Creature from the Black Lagoon. And if you've seen the movie The Shape of Water, Guillermo del Toro definitely took inspiration from her work and was thrilled to find that myself and another author, we had unearthed the story of Mildred Rossi and got her written back into Hollywood. Now, in 1940, we've got a brand new studio in Burbank, which is still there today. And yes, women were everywhere. Ladies wielding pencils. Wow. Bea Tamargo, Retta Scott, Phyllis Mooney Williams, Ray Menby McSpadden, Jerry Beaumont, Velen Sewell, who was also a pilot, Jane Fowler Boyd, who was the reference model for Maleficent. She also animated on Maleficent. Retta Davidson and Jane Baer, who is still with us today, who her studio ran her own studio, which later contributed to Who Framed Roger Rabbit. And we have ladies in post-production from Bea Salk and Nelda Marshall, Wanda Elvin Sykes, who was also a music songwriter. She wrote under the pen name of Sam Sykes. Gloria Hamilton, Shirley Gross, who was a negative cutter, and the legendary Evelyn Kennedy, who transformed many of the later films of the 40s, 50s, and 60s because of her brilliant music editing. Now, we also have a state-of-the-art paint lab. This was the Rainbow Room, where you walked in. Sorry, it's a black and white photo, but it was color everywhere. And this is where the master chemists were working to create the brilliant paint that we're going to see now restored to the true color in Cinderella. And they were indeed master chemists. They created every type of solution. I even found the formulas for their own custom soaps that would gently wash the brushes and the materials they worked with, as well as hand lotions. You didn't have a Walmart to run to in those days to go and pick up a jar of lotion, so they had to create their own. And this woman down here in the left, her name is Dorothea Jenkins. She's the first person, male or female, to win an Oscar for costume design. She got her start in the Disney Paint Labs and often credited her work in her award-winning designs by the colors that she formulated in the Disney Paint Labs on the Mickey and Minnie cartoons. So let's get to our film today. This might look a little different, but these are called conceptual or visual development designs. And these are by one of our great powerhouses in animation, Mary Blair. Mary had a brilliant talent for color. She could put two colors together that you never thought would work, and in her hands they did. They're very seemingly simple designs, but they're sophisticated in their simplicity. She was a legend. She went on and also worked in Imagineering, designing things for theme parks and advertising, and was a true talent, sadly overlooked in her day, but now, of course, we treasure her work. In Cinderella, she kept a very close hand on the color. And if you see her conceptual designs, look how angular the space, how that's created, where it makes Cinderella feel very small in this large world. And the design of the stepmother there, the wicked stepmother, how angular she is, right? That's all Mary Blair. She was the secret weapon for this film in her ability to make this story shine. So you can see how her designs translated to the final film. This was a film that saved the Walt Disney Studio coming out of the war and transformed animation. It opened up the possibilities for many more films to follow and indeed kept the studio going. So with that, I'm delighted to have shared just a wee bit of the thousands of women behind Disney animation. But we have a very special film to get on with here. So you are seeing, as Stuart mentioned, you are a very special audience because this will not show anywhere. And you guys have a terrific treat in store for you. It has been meticulously preserved to bring back the true original vision of Walt Disney and the thousands of women artists who worked on Walt Disney's Cinderella.